Hello, welcome everybody today to our webinar hosted by DevOps.com and sponsored by Sumo Logic. Today's webinar is Scale, Speed, Visibility, and More, and how the cloud is changing the business equation. I'm going to be joined by Mike McRory, and we're going to talk about this subject kind of in detail. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items. You can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them in the question dialog. I'm going to do my best to get to those questions while we're talking and near the end of the webinar, but this webinar is recorded. So it's going to be available for you and your coworkers, and you'll get an emailed out, and it's going to be available on devops.com when we're done. And we'll also try to reach out to you with answers to any of the questions that we didn't yet cover during the webinar. So to begin, first, Mike, let's get our cameras on there, show our mugs.
Alrighty.
And we have a little bit of a thunderstorm going on here in Colorado, so we'll see if that comes through. But thanks for joining us today, Mike. Can you tell me quickly about your role?
Sure. I'm currently working as a lead engineer at Nike in beautiful Portland, Oregon. And then I also do side work for a company called Fixate, which is how I know you, doing various articles about DevOps and things within the technology world.
Absolutely. I've known Mike for a long time, and he's covered the gamut when it comes to tooling and processes in the DevOps world. My name is Chris Riley. I'm editor of Sweet Code and also active contributor to DevOps.com and the media ops community there. So Mike, I'm going to ask a very obvious question, or what seems like an obvious question to start, and something that we kind of covered this, but why cloud? Why do organizations even consider the cloud?
It just takes away a lot of the complexities of running your own data center. So yeah, if you can take your stuff out to the cloud, you don't have to worry about a physical premises where you're trying to control access. You don't have to worry about having to have staff taking care of your infrastructure. Everything's out there, and you can scale, especially for a smaller company. You can start like day one, putting your stuff out there, and as your company grows, however fast it grows, you can expand, and the infrastructure is all there ready for you to use.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is that in the last few years, we've kind of gone back to people talking about private cloud and hybrid cloud, and we have public cloud, and we have multi-cloud, which is actually different than hybrid cloud, apparently, or it is, but it can get very confusing. So where do you feel like we are on the adoption and maturity of enterprises in using cloud and public cloud? And obviously for you, you guys are very active in the cloud. So where do you think organizations fall kind of on that spectrum?
I'm not sure. I still feel like we're very much in the infancy of exploring what the cloud can give to us. I think we've been given certain tools. We've learned how to use those tools. I feel like it's just beginning though. I feel like there's a whole range of opportunities there waiting that just need to be discovered on ways we can interact better with each other and just with the technology out there.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful part about being a practitioner in this space. And I think it's a lot of times we're very guilty of giving into the hype of what the cloud is, and we expect it to solve everybody's problems. And that sometimes kind of makes us feel like adoption is bigger than it actually is. But I think you're right. I think people are still kind of figuring out, in the next 3 years, we've definitely hit this point where maybe we're definitely in the early majority of adoption, I'd say, and maybe not into late adoption yet, but we've definitely hit this stage where I think people are getting real about what the cloud means for them. Whereas, the very early on adopters either were the unicorns, which were cloud native, and we should probably kind of expand what that means. and then you start to see, you know, other organizations get on. Now you see healthcare, now you see compliance, like you see the maturity curve, but you also, in terms of adoption, I still feel like we're at this point where the glamour and the veneers kind of come off, and we're looking at, you know, what this really is. And maybe that's why private cloud and hybrid cloud have become a thing. I mean, have you heard a lot about like hybrid cloud and how that works, or how we see that being adopted in organizations?
A little bit. I don't deal with it too much. Most of what I do is pure cloud right now. But yeah, I think there's, especially for companies that have existing data centers, and are trying to find ways of migrating to the cloud without just a wholesale cutover. I definitely, there's value in the hybrid cloud. And then just, you know, every organization's got different needs and different aspects of their technology solutions that they're trying to take care of, and then just different worries, different risks they're trying to mitigate. So yeah, it's very much you can determine what solution you need, and you can find it out there, whether it's pure cloud or hybrid or multi-cloud if you need to be like up 24/7.
Yeah, and in a way, you know, it's kind of like public cloud created some expectations of how the private cloud should operate. And so
Uh-huh.
now it's almost like, you know, the smartphone created expectations around user experience. I think the same thing has happened where private cloud has created expectations on how public cloud should work. And you see tooling vendors working to satisfy that. And I think that a lot has happened there, but the private cloud
Yeah.
still is kind of snowflake management administration. So now, how would you define cloud native?
Um, Cloud native is I define it as services that are built to be in the cloud. Um, uh, yeah, I don't know how exactly to describe it, but yeah, you're building your applications with the idea that you're going to deploy them out in the cloud. You're going to be able to maintain them. You're going to be able to monitor them. So when things don't go the way you expect, that you can take care of it quickly and efficiently, and preferably before your customers notice. Um, yeah, and it's it's building everything for that platform so that it's
Yeah.
optimized to run out in the cloud.
So you said something key there, and I think this is true when we talk about any modern development practices, and you'll see kind of how I'm walking into the conversation of uh, you know, the new challenges we've created, which is it's an application architecture question, and even though it's public cloud, it's still an infrastructure question that you have to address. It's not just where you store the stuff. It's also how the applications are architected to utilize the services and the infrastructure, and how you create visibility and pay attention to the applications. You know, do you feel it's true that in a big way, going to the cloud is not just a shift in using somebody else's computer? It's also big considerations on how you build, how you deploy, and how you manage your applications as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think moving to the cloud came along with the DevOps uh, revolution that we've seen as
Right.
well. And DevOps is all about ownership. And so you've got this, you're owning your platform, you're owning the services you're putting out there. And with ownership comes a lot of responsibility.
Say more about ownership. What do you mean by that? Who owns it?
Um, your DevOps engineers, your developers, your QA people. Um, you know, in the past when we had developers and we had QA engineers and you had an operations team that was going to deploy everything, there was a lot of you did your job and then you assumed people would do their job.
Right.
And when things didn't go well, there was a lot of finger pointing, like, well, I coded it right, but you know, QA didn't test it properly, or operations hasn't deployed it on the right infrastructure, and operations always point back to QA not testing and engineers not producing quality code. But with DevOps, it's there isn't any more finger pointing. It's we own this product, and we're going to make sure that it is available and it works the way our customers expect it to work.
Right.
And if it doesn't work the way they do, we're going to fix that and we're going to make it better. And I think it's made for much. It's a huge improvement in quality.
Yeah. So again, it's really fascinating when we talk about the public cloud, where we're talking about aspects of being in the cloud that have nothing to do with the infrastructure itself. You've touched on, in a way, culture, it sounds like. We've touched on application structure. And next, we're going to talk about the challenges. But do you feel like the private cloud, cloud native, is also an organizational and cultural thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I forget who said it, but there's is it Faraday's law that talks about, it might not be Faraday, but where your applications will never, they won't stray very far from like your organizational structure.
Yeah.
And so you need to create your organization in a way that communicates well and efficiently, and runs very performantly in order to create applications that run performantly and efficiently and communicate well with each other.
I think that's a scary proposition for a lot of organizations who don't want to admit that, who want to think that the applications can live wherever and in whatever environment they've been given. But
Yeah.
it's not true.
No, and the days of having your engineers away in a dark room coding by themselves are gone. It's our whole the whole culture of being an engineer is changing and evolving,
Yeah.
for the better.
Right.
But it's scary, and it's a continual evolution that we're going through.
So in some ways, the agility and the speed velocity you get from the public cloud has demanded that the organization marry that or parity that agility and speed within their teams.
Yeah, and it's like a lot of things. I think the end process, the end result is going to be far more defined processes, and things will be a lot more efficiently. But the journey there is not always easy. It's tough to go through that. It's a huge learning curve. I joined a DevOps team for the first time 4 years ago, and the first 6 months they were rough because it was a completely different worldview from what I was used to, and just learning how to do this. And you're with a team who's a little bit more familiar than you are, but they're still learning it as well.
Right, everybody's learning. Yeah, 4 years ago we
Yeah.
were all learning. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I remember
So
going to an engineer my first day on the job and saying, yeah, how do I do this? And he started to explain it, and halfway through he stopped and he said, I should explain, I've been doing this for 3 weeks now. So I'm ahead of where you are, but I don't have all the answers either. So
right, absolutely. So let's talk, culture, application architecture. Those are things that you need to understand are going to have to go with the public cloud movement. But let's talk about some of the new challenges that come with those application architectures. And touching on the application architectures first is, you have microservices, you have containers, you have Kubernetes, you have all of those things that are also something new to learn and build on top of. But also on the infrastructure side, it seems like we're going so fast and public cloud is so easy that now we have a challenge of maybe even over adoption and rogue adoption and visibility and understanding what we have. And then we have a challenge of KPIs, knowing whether or not we're using the public cloud correctly, if it's benefiting us. A whole new problem around, a whole new challenge around costing and keeping track of your costs and your consumption. Can you speak a little bit to those challenges that we've created, new challenges, I'll say, that we have to address, that we've created as we've made this massive shift to the public cloud?
yeah, it's definitely a difficult challenge. And I know there's engineers have this, we naturally want to go for the new shiny thing in the room.
Right.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's taking a step back and looking at what you're trying to develop, and saying, does this actually fit with the new shiny thing? If we all go, I know a few years ago our organization decided they wanted to go all serverless because serverless was the new shiny thing and it was going to solve all our problems. And there are definitely applications and services that we moved to serverless that it made perfect sense. But there are others that just it didn't work with. And so it's you have to you're moving really fast, but you also want to be able to put the brakes on at some point and just take a reality check and decide, is this something, should we, just because we can do this, should we be doing this? And is this really, does this allow us to deploy our applications and support them better, and also provide that service to our customers, or are we painting ourselves into a corner? And so it's taking a very objective approach to everything, and really questioning the value of what you're doing, and if it's the right direction, the right infrastructure that you're doing it on, the right tools and services that you're using.
Right, right. So one of the radical changes as a part of this is the cost of consumption and also how you account for that. You have the difference between CapEx and OpEx, which was a big transformation for organizations and had to happen at the highest level, at the CFO level. How does the cost of the cloud translate down to the individual teams? And then how does that kind of roll up to the broader development team?
I think that's a challenge that we're all still trying to figure out. So it's, I think we've done it a few different ways. We've kind of done it at the organization level, where we just kind of paid for everything. We went down to try and make it sure so every team was responsible for what they were spending. Ultimately, it comes down to that ownership again, looking at what you and your team are doing, and making sure that you're not spending more than you need to, but you're also not being so cost sensitive that you're endangering the organization and the stability of the product as a whole.
Right. Well, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I think
it's a fine line you walk.
Yeah, well, especially, I was kind of looking at it from the perspective of it's so easy to spin up an instance in the cloud. It could be too easy. And, one of the things that I envision and I've heard about happening is this idea of rogue instances where you have machines running because somebody spun it up for dev test and then everybody kind of forgets about it. But you're right. On the other side, you can create enough policies that you're just back to the days where you have to submit a service ticket to get a server, even if it's on the public cloud. So there is a crazy balance going on.
Yeah. What's that whole with great power comes great responsibility as well, where you need to, it all comes down to ownership and watching out for it. And we actually went through and did an audit a couple of years back, and we found our monthly savings, I think, was about $10,000 for shutting down instances we had out there running that people hadn't tagged properly. And if you don't tag your instances properly, they don't show up in reports. And if they don't show up in reports, no one knows about them. And so they're just out there just burning through your money. And it's, everyone's just doing maybe $20, $30 a month, but you get enough $20, $30 a month expenses that it adds up in a hurry.
Yeah. So not only do you have the cost of the actual consumption of whatever it is, I wanted to say, purely compute, but in the world of serverless, it's a little bit different. But also these services have different structures, right? So most of the public clouds, each thing has a different element that is a part of the cost, like storage, CPU, but in serverless, it's not. So the equation gets kind of wonky very fast.
It does. Serverless, in fact, in many ways, if no one's using your functions that are out there, you're not paying for them. But with compute, you're definitely paying, whether you use it or not. And there's the storage. If you've got like different queues or other tools plugged into those, you can create this whole network of little expenses that are all just adding little by little all the time.
Right. And another thing I think that, we're guilty of doing, and I recently learned, actually, I think I learned it from you, that a lot of times when we think about DevOps, we think about it in the context of building and deploying applications. What we don't think about is the cost of the pipeline itself. So if you have, Jenkins servers, if you have Kubernetes, a Kubernetes cluster up and running, like that cluster costs money also. That Jenkins server costs money. The amount of releases you're doing through the Jenkins server also determines, the scale that you need for that. What we talked about previously is, the DevOps team has to store things related to DevOps, like infrastructure as code scripts, secrets, other things that are not part of the application, but absolutely part of the delivery chain and the pipeline. What other types of things are there that you have to consider that are a part of the cost structure of a public cloud, but not necessarily directly related to the application?
Yeah, well, you've got your documentation. So you need servers to kind of handle that and sort through that. Yeah, you talked about your storage of your infrastructure, code repositories. If you have some kind of a repo where you stick your artifacts, like your libraries and that kind of thing that you need for your deployments. And then you also want to track. I know we do a lot of, as we're deploying our applications out there, we monitor the metrics that we're generating. So we measure code coverage. We measure how many of our automated tests are passing. A lot of things related to the stability of the code and the quality of the code. And we've got a huge data source where we send that to. And then once you've got your applications out there, they should be generating metrics and generating log messages and stuff. And so that it can't stay on the instances themselves. I know we've had a few times where like our logs haven't rotated properly, and it'll kill the instance, and all of a sudden, your application's not running anymore. But all of those log files, just by the nature of the cloud, should be sent to a central place. And so you have these. There are a lot of companies that created these metrics gathering and log aggregation services, and that's a huge cost right there. So you need to account for that, and the tools that you're going to use to monitor your applications and ensure that they're running optimally, and if they're not, to troubleshoot them and find resolutions.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we've done a really good job of kind of framing, the picture and the challenges. Now, it wouldn't be fair for our listeners not to start to talk about, what are some of the things that. Well, I wanted to use the term best practices, but I think you said it on your own, is that even though you're using the public cloud, like that's a place where you shove your stuff. It doesn't mean that your implementation is not unique. In a lot of cases, it is, and especially maybe even more unique is your organization and how you manage your team and your costs and so forth. But what does an organization need to think about in terms of like creating that single pane of glass and visibility into their cloud environment, especially if they have, even private cloud in a combination of clouds or multi-cloud? What do they need to think about in terms of having that level of visibility in order to, mitigate some of these challenges and not create more work because you have more variables, but also make sure that you can see what's going on very quickly in the form of maybe anomaly detection or whatever it is, and not waste a whole bunch of time, hunting for areas to optimize, or areas where you have issues or under leveraged services, whatever it is.
I think a lot of that can be solved if you take kind of the same approach that you use with test-driven development. Before you start writing your code, before you start designing your application, you need to think about how you're going to monitor it. And so, yeah, before first line of code is written, you have a plan on how are we going to look at this application to make sure it's up and running. What are we going to look at? What are our trying to think of the word. What's our success criteria to make sure this application is up and running? What are our SLA requirements? How quick do we want responses to be given to our users and that kind of thing? And then what tools are we going to put in place so if something does go wrong, yeah, we can do anomaly detection, preferably that's automated. And how are we going to be alerted that there's a problem? So you want to get all of that stuff in place beforehand. And so when your first deployment goes out, All of that stuff is looking at it. All of that stuff is monitoring it, and you have, like you're saying, a single pane of glass, so you can see exactly what's going on with your application.
Right. So one of the early in the early days of log analysis, when they became, it started to become really popular. One of the things you immediately saw, so this is what, 6, 7, 8 years ago, maybe, is IT would procure it because they had the budget. The development team didn't have the budget. They were responsible for the metrics, so they collected the data, but they also didn't share it. So when it came time for discovery of issues and so forth, that level of thinking ahead of how you're going to measure your application would hit a wall immediately, because either the IT ops team wouldn't allow you to store the data, or you could store whatever you wanted, but you weren't going to get access to it. Has that changed? Has the fiefdoms of these analysis, so it's kind of like creating the single pane of glass, but not letting anybody look through it.
Yeah, you kind of got the shade storm across part of it. I think it's changing. I think it still has a long way to go, though. I think organizations are starting to realize that if they don't open up that data, it hamstrings you, and you can't do a lot. It's a lot harder for teams to find answers to their questions. But you need to find sometimes the log information contains sensitive data, and so it's right. You need to make sure your people are trained. You need to make sure they're aware of security protocols. You need to make sure that your data is secure as well. But yeah, you definitely need to open that up and make it easy for people to access. So I think they talk about like democratizing data across the enterprise, or at least we talk about that. So opening up data so that people can have access to data. People can see they have the tools they need to fix the problems that they're responsible for.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that some of the clear benefits of that to IT is that a developer can start to debug something, especially when it's the intersection of code and infrastructure, without involving IT. And maybe also it's a thing like where I can get data from a server without having direct access to it, because a big concern is going in and logging into an instance and suddenly making it a Snowflake instance or introducing exploits. Maybe you don't want to give people access to instances, especially if there's in production, but I still need to have visibility on what's going on within that infrastructure. So there's a lot of benefits to that, but then there's another new challenge, which is analysis paralysis. Again, 7 years ago, I think that you kind of had this amazing tool, these log analysis tools where you could discover anything, but you had to dig, you had to go in there and you had to find it. And sometimes it was too much fun to do that, and you kept on doing it and doing it. How do organizations avoid the analysis paralysis?
I think it's important to leverage the help of experts. So just depending on the size of your organization, you may have a team that's spun up entirely just to look at the logs and develop tools to help people find those things more quickly. If you're a smaller organization, look at other companies out there who've identified this problem and are building tools to actively help you try and do it. So you don't have to solve these problems on your own. They're problems that every organization faces. And so either you're big enough to find the tooling and the experts to do it in-house, or you can partner with third-party companies who have the expertise and have the experience and the tools to do it more efficiently.
Yeah, that stewardship is interesting. I think giving, well, at the same time, it's funny, this is like all devil's advocate. Like cloud good, but challenging. Logging good, but too much data. And I think all of it's true. You have to just be willing to embrace that, those contradictions. But having a steward, and especially back in the days when you had to know special languages to query these systems, but having a steward that has good experiences is a fantastic tool as long as they're willing to share. At the same time, it can be dangerous if they're the ones creating specialized queries that they're the only ones that know how it works. Is that Does that still exist today? When somebody wants to dig deep, like what is the overhead or the learning curve that it takes, a developer to know where to go and start to address issues versus learn the system?
So yeah, it's definitely getting better. I know we have the tools that we use. We use them on a daily basis, and so we've gone through training classes that have shown us how to use them, how to optimize our queries, so we're not like taking down the entire organization's ability to search through their logs and stuff. I
Where's the
know that
fun
we've
of
had a
that?
problem with that. Yeah.
It's not
So,
fun if it's
but
not
yeah, so
risky, okay?
exactly. If you can't bring the whole system to a standstill with one query. Um, But yeah, no, it's we've had a lot of you need to train your people, and if you have engineers who trained in these tools, and they're able to spend a little bit of time every day working with them, and then they're able to like mentor people in their teams. I found within the teams we have here, you start to get like subject matter experts, and so everyone can query the logs and search for certain things. But if
Okay.
you need a very specific query, you know that the one guy in your team is really good about finding that one thing.
How do you
And he
know
knows
that?
that you're because you're communicating with your team, and that's part of the whole the culture of DevOps. It's not my application, it's our application, and we're all in this together to try and make it better.
So the proposition is you come to me and you say, hey, DevOps good, do that, release,
Mhm.
increase your application release velocity, all this great stuff. You're going to create some challenges to address that. You need to have a single pane of glass and visibility. But in order to use that, you need culture. So really, from the top down, like culture is a curse word, but it matters a lot. And the root of culture, it sounds like, is not we wear hoodies. It's we're willing to communicate. Is that
Yeah, we're willing to communicate. And I think there's more to it than that. It definitely needs to come from the top. Your leaders need to be actively pushing the culture and living it themselves as well. And then
right?
there's definitely communication. And I think with DevOps, I'm trying to think how to phrase this correctly. You need to embrace failure because you're going to fail doing DevOps. You're going to run into problems that you haven't anticipated. Things are going to go wrong. And when those happen, you don't stop and yell at whoever made the problem or try and figure out whose fault it was. You look at that as an opportunity. How do we prevent this from happening next time? How do we make our tools more bulletproof? How do we change our deployment strategy to prevent these kind of things happening in the future? And so mistakes become opportunities for improvement. And that comes right down from the top. Your senior management need to look at mistakes as opportunities to improve. And almost, you don't want to reward mistakes, but you don't want to punish them as well. You want to
Right.
try and create that positive change from those mistakes.
Right. Absolutely. So let's talk about now, to create this single pane of glass and visibility, how do you decide what to measure? Is it a matter of measure everything? Is it strategically you decide individual things to measure? In the measure everything scenario, accessibility to the data, searchability is important. Structure, the information architecture. If you only decide discrete things to measure, then I guess it's a little bit different, but you could be missing out on something. How do organizations approach that? Like, let's say, you're spinning up a new set of infrastructure. How do you decide what you're going to look at?
I think we do a fair amount of research first, because as people haven't faced these problems, people have faced these problems before. So you want to look at industry best practices, what sort of metrics people are looking at. And then you want to start with your infrastructure, and you look at your infrastructure and see, in order for this application to run properly, want to make sure that the processing power in the machines running properly. We've got sufficient memory. Our storage is being allocated appropriately, and you want to look at positive and negative cases, because all your
Right.
metrics might look amazing, but that it could also mean that no one's actually able to get to your service. And so you want to make sure that you are getting traffic in. You want to make sure the response times are within a
Right.
certain range. And then make
Which
sure
is
that you're not
also
exceeding resources.
So that sounds like that it's not only the data storage, it's the correlation of the data also.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then you
Now,
want to take that and move that to your application, and this is where it gets very specific to your application. You want to log metrics in such a way and log out events in such a way that you can, when something goes wrong, it's easy to go to the logs and be able to trace through and say, okay, well, this request got made, this request got made, this is the data that was sent, and this is where the error originated from. And that it makes it a lot easier to find the problem and a lot easier to resolve the problem as well.
yeah. So how do you know you're doing well? So you've adopted public cloud, you're doing all the neat things, you got visibility, you got culture, you have, and in 6 months and 1 year, how do you go back and say, and I think the obvious answer I always get is release velocity, which I don't accept. How do you know you're doing well?
Yeah, it's definitely not just release velocity. I think release velocity shows that you're able to make changes quickly and you're able to put them out there quickly, which is the whole goal of DevOps and agile development properties. But you also want to have other metrics that you're tracking as well. You want to look at how many bugs you're getting. You want to look at how quickly you can find those bugs and how quickly you can fix them. You want to look at, so that's
remediation time then, right?
Yeah, and we call it MTTD and MTTR. So mean time to detection and mean time to resolution. So those we track. Every team tracks those where I work. And then we track cycle time as well. So the amount of time it takes between getting an idea to a team and for that team to implement that team and push it out as well.
Oh.
Because you can sit and spin on the same thing over and over again and just push out releases all day long. But unless you're deploying new functionality and improving the service for your customers, it's not going to benefit anyone.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So we haven't used the word Kubernetes or microservices yet, which is pretty remarkable. How does microservices and Kubernetes change everything that we've talked about, or does it?
I think it makes everything that we've talked about more important. Because you talked about like centralized logging. If you're running a Kubernetes cluster, chances are you're going to have 10 to 15 different pods doing different things, and they're very there's an ephemeral aspect to it as well, where the device, either the what does Kubernetes use, the pod or the or your microservice instance, it might be gone 10 minutes from now, and something went bad, but you don't have a way of finding out what went wrong. So that makes this whole centralization of logs, centralization of metrics, and storage of those a lot more important.
Yeah, and you even have regions, right? Do regions, especially in the type of applications you're supporting, who's global? Like, do regions also on the public cloud add a challenge? How do you even monitor regions? I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah, you want to look at how you're performing in a region, and then you want to look at how it affects the consumer experience depending on where the consumers are. Because you could be hosting something here in Oregon in one of Amazon's data centers, but you could have users from China, you could have users from Africa or the South Pacific, and their user experience is going to be very different depending on caching you've got at the edge and just how long it takes the requests to come in and out of the system. So yeah, then you start talking about multi-region. Can we deploy this application in Asia? Can we deploy it in Europe? And then how do we monitor those so that we can show
because it could be the same exact application, or it probably is.
It probably is, yeah. And so it's, how do we set up our pipelines so we can deploy changes to all of those regions? Or do we want to deploy to one region to monitor it for a couple of hours and then deploy it to the other regions? Just a lot of questions, a lot of opportunity to improve, but also a lot of opportunity for problems to sneak into the process.
And it can be intimidating, but that's not the point of this webinar. We're not trying to tell you not to do it. I think the point is that it is remarkable what you can do in terms of speed, visibility, and scale, or I should say speed, scale. But you have to have visibility, and I think you said something really key is that you have to have the foresight to anticipate, what the monitoring and analysis challenges might be, and then think about that as you deploy the application versus after the fact, and hope that everything just works out okay.
Yeah. And I think starting with that mindset too of we need to monitor this application helps you develop it better as well. Because you could develop it one way,
Oh.
which just makes it completely impossible to measure. But if you're developing your application with the idea that we need to troubleshoot this in the future, we need to measure this in the future, I think you're going to design it in such a way that makes it easy to do those things.
So that's
And
a
so
really
the
good.
two things start complementing each other.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because there is you should be learning from this visibility too, right? You should be able to take the lessons and move on. And you just talked about one lesson, which is essentially now we know, when we design our applications this way, it works better, and we can build on top of that. What are some other lessons that organizations have, or that you've experienced, that you've gained from having good visibility into your environment?
That's an interesting question.
Well, if we didn't get to the end with an interesting question, then we did something wrong.
Yeah. I think the thing I've seen the most value out of is anytime we do have something go wrong, we have a big meeting afterwards. And it's not a what went wrong, it's what are we learning from this? And so it's not necessarily a specific challenge, but that's definitely how we're learning and we're implementing changes.
Yeah, and there's something to build on top of is the key.
And I think the thing with DevOps is it's not, you don't become a DevOps organization. You haven't mastered DevOps. It's something we're all getting better at. And you've got to start somewhere. So like you're saying, it might sound intimidating, and there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of things to consider, and there are, but start small and then just do baby steps. And as long as you're continuing to improve, your organization is going to improve as well. Don't be afraid of change, embrace it, and charge into the future with it.
Yeah, and it just put there's a lot more to consider, but all of those considerations that you make early on before you even deploy your application or build your application are beneficial long term. And so instead of being only reactive, you can be proactive, and you can improve and iterate. But you do have to build that visibility in from day one, or at the very least have to think about it.
Yes, definitely.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate it. It was nice. We were able to fold in a lot of the questions. Anyways, if you had additional questions that we didn't answer in this webinar, some specific to Mike, some specific to how the tools work, we'll do our best to get back to you at the end. I want to close out, Mike, before I do, the final goodbye. What are some of the things that you're most excited about in the evolution of public cloud in the next, 1 year, 2 years?
I'm excited to start seeing tools that allow us to go across cloud, and so we're not locked into a specific provider.
That's the multi-cloud. Yeah.
Multi-cloud, so we can use like multiple clouds, because I think we had someone from Azure, Microsoft, come to speak to us last year, and it was interesting because he couldn't promote his competitors, but he was saying, there are things our competitors do that are better what we do, and there are things we do that are better what they do. And so it's really cool to be able to go out and cherry pick. We want to try and use this service from this provider,
Absolutely.
and this service from this provider, and find ways to help those all work together, just to make the cloud a lot more easy to use and flexible as well.
Yeah, multi-cloud is a big thing, and I'll just say, as opposed to hybrid cloud, which is combining private and public. Multi-cloud is the ability to use multiple public clouds in a single, application environment. So that's great. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for joining me today. Everybody on this webinar, thanks for joining the DevOps.com webinar sponsored by Sumo Logic. Make sure you go and check out Sumo Logic as a tool, an option in your arsenal for creating that level of visibility that we talked about. This webinar was recorded. Share it with your peers. You'll get an email with a link, and it'll be available on devops.com. And like I said, if we didn't answer any of your questions, we'll try to get back to you after the webinar. But as always, we appreciate you taking the time to join us. We know how valuable that is, and hope to see you on a future webinar. So. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Chris.